然后张涵老师，你那边如果网允许的话，你录一下。如果你呃，对对对，好的好的，开始录了哈。那欢迎大家哈，又欢迎一次。嗯，今天我们有幸请来了一个来自新加坡的艺术家和诗人，同时也是艺术工作组织者 Jason。那么 Jason 现在呢，跟我一起在 Goldsmiths 这边做博士的研究。他也是一个非常有才华的学者。那因为他来自新加坡呢，其实他汉语非常好，但是他希望在就是讲到学术东西的时候，说英文会更习惯一些。这个也是很好理解的。那今天的分享一会儿包括他的自我介绍，可能都是以英语为主，有些关键地方他可能会说一些中文。那我也用英文稍微的介绍一下哈。Welcome Jason to join us for today's sharing session. Um, 哦，我刚才已经用汉语介绍过他了哈，再用英语介绍过再介绍一遍有点怪。He is actually the most talented researcher and artist I have ever met in my 20 years of academic life, as a student or as a teacher. Um, and actually, I think he's also a curator, and he is also activist in his community and also cross culture. He works across Europe and Singapore and the UK. Well, the UK is technically not part of Europe now, um, and Pan Asia. And his work also took different forms in terms of writing, exhibitions, organizations, activities, and art making. And he's very knowledgeable, a lot of references and resources that you can ask him. He's like the encyclopedia in our office. And so yeah, let's be brief and welcome Jason. And he's gonna introduce himself to you guys a little bit later. Yeah, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Kaya. Hello，朋友，你们好。我是新加坡来的，中文名叫汉聪。But you can call me Jay. Almost everyone close to me calls me Jay or Jason. 我谈工作的时候比较习惯用英语，所以so if you don't mind, I'm going to speak mostly in English, but I will speak slowly. 我本身是艺术家，也是写作的。And it's something that I've done for a long time. I've always wanted to be a writer, and for a time I couldn't write when I was younger. So instead, actually, art became my voice, my in some ways my main voice. And then slowly the writing came to me later in life. I write mostly poetry. I have written about 4 books of poetry, and I will talk a little bit about the 4th book that I completed while I started Goldsmiths last year. So I completed that in November, December. And my own kind of history is moving through a different set of media. 我当时去纽约的时候是读photography. So I studied photography in a very specific way, in thinking about it as in relation to video, but also in relation to digital technologies. Then later on, I went to the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program, which is a studio-based program, but it involves a lot of theoretical seminars that draws a lot from a kind of Marxian tradition. And subsequently, I also did a graduate degree in an architectural school. So partly because I was really interested in questions of space, and I was interested in what it means to think about public space, the commons, and artists moving through space. And so that will be the second thing that I will talk about a little today. Our relationship to the space that we move through, that we find ourselves in, and how we can make some claims on those spaces. 我们怎么可以说这些空间是我们的? You know, how do we say it belongs to us, right? And after some time, I had also run a space in Singapore called Grey Projects, 灰色计划, and it is a artist residency. It is also art library, as well as an exhibition space. From there, we do residencies. We've done residencies with spaces in Japan, in Taiwan, in Indonesia, in Korea, but we've also done residency projects with spaces here in Europe, with spaces in Spain, and also as far away as South America. And we publish, and we publish 2 or 3 books, sometimes in conjunction with exhibitions and sometimes just as independent projects. And that's also something that I will draw on. It's what my 4th book is about, thinking through the history of what it means to publish, to support someone else's writing. And through Grey Projects, we also think of ways in which an artist can work in ways that sit within a history and tradition of making exhibitions, but possibly also outside of that. So I'm interested in ways in which an artist can begin thinking about para-exhibition activities. So things that maybe could sit alongside, but sometimes also sit away from an exhibition, that themselves, without appearing in the name of art, is nonetheless the work of an artist. And I want to, you know, it's a bit of a fine point, but I wanted to assert that point, to say that an artist's work can encompass these other things. So in some ways, what Kaya is doing with this space, that of discussion, of exchange, you know, I think of also as the work of an artist, right? And I think for myself about ways in which that is also an artist's work for me. And so distinguishing an artist's work quite separately, but also together with an artwork, right? And that is partly why I'm in the program that I'm in right now, together with Kaya. And that's a long way of saying why I'm also thinking about things that today that I want to talk about, awkwardness, that seems to touch on a body of work that I've made, as well as a book that I've written, but also you can hear from it, hopefully, things that are related to aspects of just us as individuals, but specifically me as a queer person, moving through spaces and thinking about what that movement and that passage might feel like for myself, but also how it's experienced for somebody else. Right. So I will share with everyone today in really about 3 parts. So the first, I'll talk a little bit. I won't share so much visually quite yet. So I'll talk a little bit about awkwardness, partly just so that we have a sense together of what I mean when I say awkwardness. So in Mandarin, I suppose you can say it's a bit like 尴尬, you know, and I then want to talk about awkwardness in relation to this moment in 2018, 2019, when I was invited to create a body of work. So I'll talk to that situation a bit. And I'll show some images, the body of work that came from that, and then relating that to me thinking generally about how perhaps awkwardness is pointing us to a kind of necessary difficulty. And how I began thinking about that also in terms of poetry, our negotiations with difficult situations. So that's roughly the three parts. I'll talk a little bit about awkwardness for now, and then I'll show the body of work and describe that situation a bit, and then we'll relate it to poetry and a video work. Okay, so I'll start by talking about awkwardness. And I want to talk about awkwardness not as the introduction to my work exactly. I want to talk about it really as a way to think about some of the problems that these works have encountered, and that some of the problems that they continue to have, or the problems that others may continue to have with my work. I'm really thinking about an experience in 2018, 2019 that has been on my mind when I received a foundation's very timely support to make a set of images. And this set of images I was already thinking about for a while. I was thinking about them for over 2-3 years that I finally got a chance to create thanks to this foundation. And I'm also thinking about the experience of making this work, because this work has produced frictions, accusations. I've had strangers who encountered the work who became antagonists, and also friendly viewers who then also turned alienated. And in thinking about this experience, I began thinking about what it means for different participants in this event feeling the way they do, feeling awkward. And it's the key event that I will discuss later today. Because this idea increasingly takes hold of me, that the discomfort that I and others experience is not a poor reflection of their inability to describe ways of being that are vastly different from theirs as anything but deviant or corrupt. So awkwardness doesn't mean that, for what I'm thinking about is that it doesn't reflect poorly on people who are uncomfortable with me, or uncomfortable with the work or the knowledge that I'm producing or sharing. And it doesn't reflect necessarily on their inability to accept or tolerate something that's different, or their inability to describe difference as something other than deviance or corruption, right? And I'm also thinking of this discomfort as something other than also my poor grasp of persuasion. So it's likely that this situation so one way of thinking about why this situation is awkward is that maybe I'm just bad at talking about my work, and I'm bad at presenting my work. And so as a result, that leads to awkwardness. So I'm thinking, okay, that could be true, but what if that's not true, and yet we are all still feeling the way we do, right? And in that situation, I'm thinking of ways in which what was demanded was clarity, but what was present was ambiguity. And when the sought after answer on people's mind might be conviction, and instead I had offer only questions and perhaps more uncertainty. So in thinking about awkwardness, I'm drawing on the work of a particular philosopher, Alexandra Plakias, but I'm also drawing myself away from it. So in thinking about awkwardness, I, like Plakias, I'm distinguishing it from shame and guilt. Okay, so I'm saying that awkwardness is different from shame and it's different from 内疚。尴尬跟内疚不一样 ，OK， 跟羞耻不一样 ，OK。So in part because shame and guilt arrives in our bodies as responses to the introduction or the imposition of moral categories or ethical imperatives. Okay, someone imposes these on you, on us, and therefore we feel, 内疚 or we feel 羞耻, right? So we feel shamed and we feel we feel guilty. But also, as you can hear, in part, I want to distinguish it because shame and guilt relies on normative agreements on the behavior in question to press us into those feelings in order that we may seek exculpation from those who press against us, meaning that we seek to be somehow released by those who press those feelings upon us, who press the demand of guilt and shame upon us. So one popular culture, very GIF worthy, it's already a GIF, is that scene in Game of Thrones when Cersei Lannister disrobes and submits to the Walk of Atonement, as the crowd throws at her and shouts, "Shame, shame." So in that way, you know from that scene that the experience of shame is also simultaneously at the same time the experience of atonement, right? So you experience shame and guilt in order to be free of those who accuse you, to be released by those who accuse you. But also I want to separate, another reason for me to separate awkwardness away from these feelings is that if it doesn't move us, shame and guilt can sometimes move us to seek these forms of release, but it can also pressure us to withdraw from public space and public consideration. So we decide, okay, then we just withdraw into entirely public humiliation. So we say like, oh, 这个太苦了，我们自己承担就好了，然后我们就退出。So we completely withdraw because of shame and guilt, right? And we can experience this at the same time, right? We can experience this in a given situation as interlocked experiences. So shame, guilt, and awkwardness can be a messy knot of feelings. And we humans are seldom great at disentangling the messiness within ourselves. But we can feel shame and guilt without feeling awkward. It also tells us that we can feel awkward without feeling shame. We feel awkward in mutual uncertainty, right? When neither or none of us actually know what's right. So instead of, in shame and guilt, sometimes there's a informal acceptance of what is right or appropriate. But I suggest that awkwardness is when none of us or neither of us knows what's right or appropriate in that moment. And in that uncertainty, awkwardness envelopes our core determination of what we can do. So as we try and figure out, as we try and determine what we can do with and for and in step with each other, that experience is awkward, right? So awkwardness, I also want to distinguish it from social anxiety and also from embarrassment. And also in this moment in English, in this moment of the internet, what in English we call it the cringe, oh, so cringe, right? And the cringe, at least in English, just in case, I'm sure you know, but in case you don't like that, it is the reaction to someone who unconsciously or very, very self-consciously is missing the mark or missing the point, or at the very least, missing a mirror, missing a way of just looking at themselves doing what they're doing, right? When we hear someone describe a situation as cringe, oh, that's so cringe, right? You see in a comment, oh, that's so cringe. Often what they are expressing is pity, disgust, and in sometimes more strong situations or stronger feeling, they are expressing contempt, right? So the calling attention to a social feeling is softer than condemnation, right? But at the same time, it's also harsher than laughing at yourself, right? So when someone says it's cringe, it's not as though they are attacking you necessarily, right? It's not necessarily an attack, but at the same time, it's harsher than someone making fun of themselves, right? So it's in between those two things, right? So so it's revealing that when the person who is acting cringe is embarrassing themselves, but we are also embarrassed alongside them. So when someone's saying that cringe, often they are saying that they're embarrassed watching them, but they're also embarrassing themselves watching, right? So in this way, the cringe can be starts from a description of you saying, oh, someone is embarrassing themselves. But very quickly, it can also be you embarrassing yourself, watching someone embarrassing themselves. And so what this means is that as you point out cringe, that pointing itself can quickly be cringe, right? So what I have in mind instead is those situations where no one is embarrassed, right? So what this means is that no one missed a social cue. No one missed a point of discussion. So none of that is a miss. Yet, in that situation, in a given situation, someone nonetheless is awkward. Or in the situation that we can find ourselves in is that everyone actually in that situation is feeling awkward. So in this way, awkwardness is experienced as a discomfort, as a sense of disequilibrium. 有点不对劲, something is just off, right? And it's because our social coordinates start to lose their usual predictable rigidity. So certain sets of rigid expectations start to lose their rigidity, and they begin to tilt away from each other, creating disproportion and iridymia. Iridymia is in ways where we are out of rhythm, right? So one way to think about it is, I'm borrowing an analogy from a digital photograph. So imagine these coordinates as multi-colored pixels, each color designating a particular kind of coordination, whether of timing, of physical coordination, being at the right place, for example, or moving in the right way. And these color pixels, they map and lay onto each other to give us our image of the social world, right? But in awkward situations, imagine that this image begin to melt. So you've seen a melting image, right? Distorted either by when someone is doing PS, but you can also imagine it like a photograph melting in the heat. So they begin to melt into uncertainty or into unrecognizable form. Right. So in the absence of predictability, a failure of coordination can happen in timing. So what this means is, for example, of simultaneity. So that means 同时发生的东西, like in the case of when two individuals start talking at the same time, when it's might be better if it's one before the other. but it could also be of timing in terms of acceleration and delay. Sometimes it's awkward because, you ask a question or offer a point and then one person responds too fast. Like, oh, or they respond too slow, right? And so awkwardness begins to describe a maladjustment. But I don't want to suggest a maladjustment as in like we are not adjusting properly. 我们还没有找到平衡, right? But I don't want to suggest that that there must immediately be a kind of equilibrium or 平衡, right? Or that someone must bring that in. Because in fact, I think sometimes the awkwardness persists because the individuals caught in that situation try to assert the previous coordinates in order to find that 平衡. Okay, so they keep trying to assert it even as those coordinates are melting. Or in another way is that everyone is trying to find a new set of coordinates or a new set of protocols and principles. So they're trying to find, in some ways, a new norm, right? Or a new way finding, right? And this is the moment that I want to rest in. Like, what if it becomes impossible at that moment for anyone to find that new norm? And folks do not want to return to the old set of coordinates, to the previous set of coordinates that have melted away, right? So imagine a situation where a group of people haven't yet figured out the future that they want to arrive at. They just know that the previous one that they just left behind is dissolving in a way that they cannot reassert it. Reasserting it will only produce more awkwardness, right? So this moment is what I want to come to. So right now, I want to then share with you this moment that I had in 2018, 2019, when I was invited by the Exactly Foundation, which is a foundation set up by a very nice Chinese woman, Madam Chung, or Mrs. Chung, or Lily. And Lily is committed to funding photo-based research projects. And in 2018, she was very interested in queer issues. For that year, she always works to find artists and photographers who are, in her mind, addressing certain kinds of urgent or subjects that should be discussed. So either they are urgent or she thinks they should be discussed, right? Or she thinks that, so she's always looking for artists working either in the urgent or the important. And so in 2018, she decided that she would like to work with someone who is working specifically with queer spaces or queer history and so on. She's very much hoping that she can start a discussion about a law that exists at the time called 377A. And that law was left behind by the British into a number of its colonies. So this law exists, or versions of this law exist in, for example, in India, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in different ways. The languaging has some variations, but more or less, this law is shared across these common post-colonies of the British. And the different post-colonies have done different things to this law. So in Hong Kong, they've done different things to this law. And at some point in for example, India's Supreme Court had repealed this law, right? And Lily was interested in ways of addressing the implications of this law. So just keeping that in mind, she has a particular way of thinking about what an artist can do and what she wants to do with when she funds this artist. So her way of supporting an artist typically is that she offers grant support. She gives you time to produce the work. And then when you've produced the work, as you are producing the work, at some point she asks for a sharing session in which she will ask the artist to nominate some names for a dinner, over a sharing dinner. But most of the names in that dinner, she comes up with herself. So you know some of the names, but actually most of the names that she will invite actually might be unknown to you. And there's a reason for that. She tries to, in this dinner, she tries to, because remember, she's interested in developing issue-based conversations. So her way of thinking about this is to find and invite people to have a conversation who takes very different positions. Right. So in my case, what that meant was that she didn't just invite, say, the artists or the curators that I had nominated. She also invited religious people. She also invited very conservative religious people. She's invited people from art forms that she thinks is related to the way I'm working, but might have very, very different goals. And she's also invited so she's also invited, as a result, not just queer folk or queer allies, but really sometimes just straight folks that are really complete strangers, either to the art world, to art making, and also to me, right? I had asked to do a work that is really about the negotiation of that individuals make with public space. Like, how do we decide a space is ours? And I started looking at these different spaces in Singapore that I knew as almost like a teenager, that I knew way back, but I haven't explored for a long time. I always knew that these were places that people can go to find each other, especially when it gets dark or in the quiet hours, right? So there are these places in parks or parking areas or around Singapore, around the island, that people go to meet each other. And this isn't necessarily an entirely secret activity. So sometimes these spaces actually have family moving through them. You know, family would park and move away, or people who use them for sports. So you often have a lot of casual athletes using them. And I started going to observe these kind of cruising activities, right? And began creating and documenting my time there. So I would spend, I'm interested in partly in how they move through this space. How is it, how at certain times actually the activity that happens in these spaces becomes a kind of informal claim on the space. And I begin to see this movement as a kind of choreography, but also as a kind of awkward choreography, because there's always miscue, there's always delay or acceleration. Sometimes someone is always moving too fast or too slow to generate the coordination. Often there is repetition. Sometimes people, like I said, was trying to respond to the same cue at the same time in a way that makes coordination difficult, right? And so I was interested in the way that a certain kind of discomfort was always sitting alongside desire. So these queer individuals, these men were often there to find each other, but there's always that desire to want to seek each other out. But at the same time, I notice it always sits alongside certain discomfort. This discomfort has nothing to do with, again, like shame or guilt or embarrassment. No one is there to make them feel shamed or guilty. The people who pass through the space, like I said, often just, they know something's happening and then they just pass through it. No one complains. And often also there is, partly because of the way that they move, there is no need for any one person to, even in the moment of rejection, like if you are not interested in another person, there's no need to embarrass the other person. There's ways in which you can simply just continue moving through that space. And so I had created this initial set of images for the discussion. And so I just want to quickly have a kind of brief content warning that, I mean, it's a little bit late now, but that there's, that some of this have suggestive sexual content. And in the dinner presenting this work, because I was introduced to a dinner that didn't entirely have people I'm familiar with, and I was made aware very quickly that actually some people might arrive and actually be kind of immediately disagree with the potentially sexual content or implication of the work, and also what it means to have just, so they might even disagree very quickly with just this idea that there's a public space where there's family moving through, and that at the same time, you have queers moving through it, doing such visible things, right? So immediately just that idea disagrees with them. And then there are other folks that, so I began to talk in a way that my talking and my presenting at the dinner very quickly itself became awkward. I was trying to be careful in a way that I didn't want to endanger anyone that I was talking about. So I didn't tell anyone who was present at the dinner about where this place. Some people wanted me to point out where these places are. I didn't fully describe. So, I didn't fully describe. So this is the example of the dinner. I didn't fully describe what I was doing, how I managed to shoot the photographs, because again, I wasn't sure at the time, because of these strangers, if I should identify immediately as in a way that acknowledges how this actually is part of my history, my own history of learning about myself. And I had, so partly I talked in a way that's also about a kind of self-protection. And then also I was wanting to, in some ways, wanting to acknowledge a different alignment of the work, right? Like I understand that in some ways you could talk about my work in terms of free movement, or the freedom, a certain freedom to be yourself. But at the same time, I wasn't necessarily keen the same way that Lily was interested in mobilizing an artist's work as an act of persuasion, of persuading people who are perhaps unaware of these activities, that people like this still also have a right to exist, also have a right to be. So for me, there is I don't know that those forms of persuasions are actually ever successful or possible, right? As in some ways as a staged performance. You know, sometimes I feel like a part of me thinks that those convictions where people can change their minds about something in some ways happen quite separate from someone trying to stage that for them, right? They have to find in some ways their own paths for discovery. So all that combined into you know, an awkward dinner that also then resulted in an awkward publication. So I'm sharing with you also. So part of what she does is that after the dinner, she asks everyone at the dinner to write a response to the work. So there are artists, for example, who responded to the work here, who you know, and they can tell me how they want things to change, or ask me questions about the work. They suggest looking at Kohei Yoshioki's work in a public park in Tokyo. So these are where the three images are from. This is a landmark work from the 70s about sexual activities in that are mostly of a heterosexual nature in a park in Tokyo in the 70s. But at the same time, there were also works, as you can see here, you know, like by this Reverend Dr. Stephen Gunn, who says, you know, it is like what the Bible says about people preferring to do the unacceptable under the cover of darkness, you know. Or another pastor that, and these are people I don't know who they are at all. Another one who says, you know, that people in same-sex relationships, they seem lost. You know, and again, so as a result, they read shame into the activities. They read like, see, there's a lot of secrecy, hush, hush, hiding from people. And then there are also others who, because of the awkwardness of the situation, some folks immediately try and impose coordinates of understanding that they bring that are not negotiable. So for example, Felicia, who's a very well-respected artist working with practice in community-involved practice or socially engaged practices, she has a view of, she really wanted my work to be read as a way of changing people's minds about the law. So she thought that I'm doing, she wanted it the same way that Lily had wanted it. She wanted the work as a social force. So for her, then she applies certain ways of thinking about what's socially ethical onto the work, you know, about what it means to, so if this is going to be like, so if this is going to be, she imagines that this work is actually meant for a general public audience, in which case then there consent derived from every individual depicted and who are performing on camera. But I didn't ever have that in mind, that I didn't think that this was a work that was meant for that. And I didn't think that this was a work that was was also meant for convincing a general public. So yeah, so that's the situation. So it got me thinking that, so coming back to what I was coming back to awkwardness, I began thinking, a drag queen a drag queen and a friend who came for the dinner, she wrote something that I will read, and it kind of describes the awkwardness for you, right? So she says, as I sat in Lily's home, listening to her reasons for being interested in Jason's work, something about confronting the law, sharing space with other queers, but also sharing the same space with people who I know have been silent about supporting the change in the law, and people who I deeply suspect, in fact, actively support the law. Listen to Jason's attempt to share these pictures he was making and trying to speak very carefully to the spaces and conditions in which he was making them. Listening to the questions that were being asked, watching the pursed lips and the folded arms. It is weird to generally like someone, she means that she likes Lily, go to their home and at the same time feel unsafe. It feels like a betrayal. Then she continues a bit later on, says, I'm not saying that Jason should not be making these images. He should. But how are these images shared to whom? And what do we say about them? Why do we even share them at all? It is uncomfortable to say, but the conditions of this presentation were a little reckless. It strikes me that when we talk about certain marginal groups, we must have care, right? So Becca was immediately reaching for a language of care, of safety, and I understand that desire, right? But it also got me thinking. There is the awkward situation I encountered with people who I know are disagreeing with me, and then there's immediately the sense of wanting to move towards perhaps a different set of coordinates around questions of care and safety. But in the past, at that time when the book came out, my thoughts were very quickly about this, like thinking, how can I find and create audience for the work that's much more careful. But in the past years, I've been thinking, what if I have moved too quickly to thinking about this, what I'm familiar with as a sense of safety and a sense of care? What if awkwardness tells me that the awkwardness of the situation tells me that there is a kind of necessary difficulty that all of us needs to move through in some ways, either together or singly. I'm not offering a sense of a methodology, or I'm not offering a sense of any solution, but I'm suggesting that the awkwardness was pointing to a way of thinking that might be yet another path that I haven't fully explored the possibilities, and then there might be something productive there. Productive in the way that not that I necessarily feel like I can change someone's mind, but I'm thinking about the ways in which the awkwardness can allow me to claim certain spaces either for this work or for myself. In the same way that these men can move through a public space without ever changing what everyone else is doing in those spaces. But they nonetheless can say that these spaces are theirs, right? So I'm thinking about the ways in which if I find myself in a situation like that, I nonetheless, despite the difficulty, can make the situation in some ways my own, right? And so at this point, I want to just I want to share with you a little bit. So I'm thinking about ways in which for example, awkward things can be visualized in a way that maintains some of, but not all of the information. So what I've done with the images eventually was that I printed them, but I also scrambled them. So you can see some things, and you can see some things in glimpse. So you are aware that, and then the way that they are scrambled also introduces a level of kind of coding of another language, right? So there's something else going on in those layers that you can try, that you understand that there are multiple ways of speaking about that situation that does not quite settle into one thing. And there are also absences, right? And so a closer look at what they are like. So you can see I cut them all with the same knife. I cut all the images with the same knife, which is why that these images can be exchanged and collaged with each other. And the reasons for these colors, these almost monochrome colors, is that in some cases I come up very close to an object and I photograph it, so it's almost pure color. Like when I come up very close to a tree, or when I'm very near, I'm standing very near the backlight of a car, right? And that the light, the signal lamp from the car completely whites out the camera. So I'm also thinking that perhaps also this way of thinking about how space belongs to any one person or subject, even if that sense of belonging is tentative, contingent, ephemeral. But the idea that even that claim could be made could allow folks to think about how to exist under difficult conditions, right? So I'm in the final bit where I want to think about back to existing under difficult laws, and then and also my response a number of years later to the same space. So I'm thinking about awkwardness as a kind of necessary choreography, right, that we make. So we are trying to basically figure out how to move through a set of conditions that might not compromise themselves for our agency or for our subjectivity. But nonetheless, we need to somehow claim belonging, and even if in short temporary situations, the sense of our belonging, if not to a place, at least to a moment in time. Right. So I wrote this book that is about publishing under another law that the British introduced. So it's so you can hear the relatedness. This law is called the Undesirable Publication Act, or the Undesirable Publication Ordinance. So this 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 law was introduced by the British in the I'm going to add it to the chat so everyone can. So this law was introduced by the British in the 1930s, and it was originally meant to discourage anti-colonial or anti-imperial publications. But slowly over time, it became to be, this category of the undesirable began to be anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-languages, certain forms of languages, and then it became anti-vice, it became anti-queer, it became anti-sex, and so on, right? So it began to grow, so that suddenly this idea of the undesirable began to seem like many things are undesirable. So you begin to think as a writer, then how do you move through this set of conditions? Like, how do you decide what to write about? And how, like, if you do want to write about something that seems undesirable, how are you heard? How can you nonetheless be seen, and so on? So this book began to be so this book began to be it takes the form of a publisher's diary. So I began to think about, imagine a publisher that has to work under this law for 30, 40 years, and what that experience will be like. So I just want to quickly read to you some entries from this diary. And I would also share it so you can see it. The custom officer opened my bags, carefully thumbed the spines of the 20 or so books. Who are these for? He opens one cover to read the colophon. Myself. Can anyone read this much? Doubt. What do you do? Wait. Writer. He replaced the book. Any of these yours? Why not? I write. His pen tapped the paper forms. What does that make me? When I pick up that same book, I put back ash. A fire you can't see that I walked in, will walk through. Call no one a writer until they're dead. A fire for my friends and I. The book decides if we are ash or alive. I watched the striped blue cow, which this is a butterfly called the striped blue cow. Okay, I watched the striped blue cow stepping out, its iridescent future already visible through its translucent case. In 1960, 3 Teochew songs were refused. In 1965, 9 Taipei publishers of wuxia illustrated stories were refused. In 66, the gramophone of songs in the Mandarin film Little Belle was refused, though the film was released the previous year with no deletions, because it was thought in a movie picture those undesirable words were not conspicuous enough to draw the audience's serious attention, the Assistant Secretary of Publications wrote. As its wings dries, the blue brightens in our eyes. Not any pigment, solution, or vessel containing that blue, but architecture's consequence. Structures smaller than a wavelength of light, spinning and unbraiding a beam until the phrase of blue thread through our eyes. In 67, the power to detain books at customs and post offices are extended to roadside stalls and book rental clubs. In 68, 3,725 books and 44 gramophone records were refused. Of the books, 11 were Tamil, 3 in Malay, and the rest were Chinese languages. In 69, an appeal against the refusal of the Fantastic Four comic annual a comic hetero never refused was itself refused. If the architecture is well ordered, like a pure crystal, the color changes as our eyes saccade or its wings hover. Disordered structure helps the butterfly throw off at every angle of its flight that startling shade of sapphire sky. So I'll stop here, but it gives you a sense of the, these diary entries and how the law was applied, how folks thought about the law and so on. And finally, I want to just I came back to so this has been on my mind for a while, and I came back to it when I was doing a work for the Kochi Biennial. And if you know me, you know that I really don't think of myself as a performer. I don't enjoy being I've tried theater before. I don't enjoy being like under a spotlight on stage. And I decided that as I was writing this book, that I wanted to return to the same spaces that I had looked at initially for the cruising and find a spot in it and in some ways claim it for myself. So I will end with the video that I made for the Kochi Biennial. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for this wonderful sharing. Well, that's but so first question that I want to ask, does it have a sound in your video that you shared? Is it just a mistake that we can't hear
Oh,
anything?
you can't hear anything.
No, we
Oh, I'm so
didn't hear
sorry.
anything, but it makes sense. I mean, the pure image without any sound is a silent. The moment of silence is very awkward in a way. Nothing's in the headphone, and yeah,
Oh,
it's
I'm
very
sorry.
awkward.
Okay, okay.
It
Yeah, that's
adds
actually
to
a
the
sound.
awkwardness. It
Yeah.
adds to the awkwardness. Probably a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah. So what's that lack? What kind of sound that they have?
Actually, it has oh, that is awkward. There's actually a soundtrack to it. It's like a beat. I don't know if I can.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, you can do that like a glimpse of it.
yeah.
We can. You need
Let
to
me
tick
see if I can
the
do it.
share audio. You need to
So
tick the
actually,
share audio at the bottom of the confirmation. Like you select the app, the window that you want to share, and at the bottom there's a share audio box that you. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, you can do it. Thank you. It's
Thank you.
yeah, with the claps, it makes it more awkward. Oh yeah, so it's very interesting. Let's jump to the Q&A and have a chat with everybody who wants to talk. 大家好，我们现在可以就是聊一聊，如果你愿意讲中文也可以，然后如果需要翻译成英文也可以，如果你愿意打字也可以啊。我们这个 sharing 就是不会要求一个 uniform 的 formality，所以大家可以尽量减少大家的 anxiety。对，然后这边是还有一个 caption 的问题，他让我 confirm 我的语言啊，不 confirm 的，我们讲我们的语言。好，那要不然不然我就先开始问问题。我先用中文问吧，这样方便大家来听。就是我觉得特别打动我的一点就是你分享的这个话题，它有很多很多非常非常 subtle 的 insight。就是你一开始是 distinguish 了很多不同的 feelings，有的是跟 social norm 有关，有的是跟这个有 value 的 tendency，但是 awkwardness 可能它是一种 uncertain state，它是一种 a state of curiosity。然后我觉得我非常同意这一点啊，因为我的 research 实际上很早以前，它一个很重要的一个方面，现在也是了，是关于 infree thing 啊，是关于这个 in between stages，是关于这个differences in temperature in April and November，是这种就是我们用呃 nominal standards 不能去划分的，或者是不能去感知的一些中间地带。那么呃，但是很有意思的是，你提到 Lily 的那个项目，就是我相信这个它也是 leads to 可能是一个很底层的一个 fundamental concern in your work is you're making art out of awkwardness, like on the topic of awkwardness, and that potentially makes things public. It's more public than a informal awkward moment. It's more public, more permanent, more staged, more obvious. So there's a tension here. One is being discreet, being cautious, being caring, being underground, being see the place you're doing your performance is under the bridge and behind the bushes. That's those terrains, those urban spaces. I remember one of my teachers, he said it's a terrain vague, in the in-between spaces in cities, abandoned places. On one hand, a lot of things, those spaces allow things to happen in a more organic and at their weak and starting stage. On the other hand, there's a need of discourse, a need of openly discuss, a need for those hidden transcripts become public. That's James Scott's analogy. And also the analogy, the discussion or the differences between Foucault and Judith Butler. Foucault once said like gay community is more persecuted by the public than the lesbian community is because like it's openly repelled, but lesbians you can just like have things happen in the dark and nobody cares. And Butler, she was against this, and she said, look, at least you get a discourse. you get a name like when we talk about homosexuality, people like 80% of time people come out with the idea of gay homosexual activities instead of a lesbian. Like you don't even have words for that. Like you don't even have like you have like for gays you have anal sex and you have those terms in laws, and for lesbians you don't even have those terminologies for that. Like as if it's not existing in the world. 但他们就 both sides make sense. One is things can't happen, right? And one is, look, we need to talk about this. 我可能有点混乱，我这个
Oh
在两个语
no,
言之间
no,
切换。我就
很清楚。
觉得很巧妙的一点，在你的作品中就是在这个 being being frontal, being open，然后从另外一个又是 being vague, being hidden。在这个最巧妙的是，它不停的在这两个size 之间在跳跃。而这
Yeah,
种跳跃的过程，它不仅发生在你对作品的思考，你的那个写作等等这些里边，还发生在就是它整个的这个不同的作品的阶段，从这个 performance making、documentation、showing、write about it、talk about it，这个我觉得会是一个很好玩的事情。那么我们有什么？就是这两个 size，一个是being careful, being hidden，一个是 being open, being 只要我不尴尬，尴尬的就是你们。as being this, so how can we balance this? How can we reconcile these two modes of thinkings? And what potentially can art do in this
yeah.
conflict?
No, I think it's 一个很好的问题. And I think it's a great question because um, I think um, I think often like many artists, but also like queer artists, face this question, right? So queer art 艺术家通常会面对这个问题，which is that you must be 你要公开要坦白要透露才算是 political, you know. So you must uh, you must confront the subject, you must be open, you must be transparent, you must disclose in ways that then can be recognized as being political or being engaged with the subject. But I think that that for me narrows what's possible for art and artists. I think that actually there are other ways of being engaged. I think there are other ways of being of showing a certain consciousness of the difficulties that that lie ahead for all of us, right? So part of me thinks that that there's that I don't disagree that I agree that actually strategies of disclosure can can be highly effective. I just also think that I want to make room for other strategies and other ways of art making. And part of that is thinking partly about abstraction and partly thinking about how something can be visible but undisclosed. 所以可以看得见，可是可能不需要我们公开的透露。Right. So it's the way that, for example, like so many of us can move through a space and without having to just announce ourselves, we can actually hold that space as our own. Like, and in so many different ways, we've done that in our own lives. So I'm thinking that just tells me that there's something possible for art as well. And so that means that instead of trying to find balance, so 其实我在找的不是一个好像 一个平衡点，一个可以有共同的时间，可以有两个东西的 situation，you know. So I'm not looking to do necessarily both in one work. But I'm looking for ways, one, that instead I'm looking for ways in which, one, I can actually enter spaces that assume that invisibility or abstraction is imposed on us. Yeah. And in fact, I want to take those things and turn them into moments of agency. Yeah. And the second thing is that, so is that I want to suggest that that sometimes not speaking, but while present, is just as powerful as being present and speaking. So that sometimes sometimes the not speaking can be awkward because you're present but you're not speaking. It can be awkward.
Yeah.
But I want to suggest that may be a way through a difficult situation. Yeah. So it's not to, because sometimes it might be more, in some ways, more powerful for us not to speak, especially when the insistence is for you to speak a certain way. So 你可以说话吧，你说话的方式跟空间的 it's already set in a certain way, and it's better to just not speak and refuse that, right? And then also then to think that sometimes what we just resting there for now, like that I think there are ways in which it's that the awkwardness is telling us that a certain demand for balance and resolution isn't actually internal. So it's not necessary for our agency. In fact, it's actually an imposition. So in the Foucault-Butler tension, for example, right, that you said that on one hand, one philosopher is saying we are more openly targeted. On the other hand, is the sense that, well, at least you have a language of description. Yeah. But I also want to suggest the third, which is that sometimes there is that there is potential that we haven't explored in being undescribed by an external force. In this case, in Butler's case, the external force is the law, right? But I want to admit that, but there are actually moments where when it remains undescribed by an external force, it means that in this uncertainty, the external perception, someone entering into this space might feel intensely awkward. But for those of us who are familiar with the uncertainty, actually, there's a lot of interesting potential, and in fact, this potential might potentially code more pathways for movement, and so in that way, it can feel more freeing. Yeah. So, for example, a reversal of that situation is that the one that you described, where gay men are and gay activity is described more often in anti-sex laws than lesbian activities, right? But there's a reversal of the situation in that generally in the regulation of bodies, women's bodies are more described in law in the way that it's, abortion, marriage, childbearing, inheritance, and so on, right? So in fact, actually, if it was under-described in the other direction, actually, it might be more free if women's bodies weren't so intensely described as opposed to men, right? So that's kind of one way to think about it. Yeah, that in fact, if we push for a situation where, like stop speaking via or through or acknowledging the external force, but allowing this uncertainty to stay in a state of constant social negotiation, even if it's awkward, might potentially be more freeing. Yeah.
I've been also thinking if there's a third dimension, there certainly it could be. You mentioned about the dimension of speaking out versus the dimension of being present without speaking. I'm also thinking about a third dimension, like being without presence. Well, that's basically the being underground, but so what sustains the being without presence situation where what kind of what's the power of the weak, of the weakest being without presence? Because we think about this in a way that, for example, like the space under the bridge is being, but is not very present. No, like we don't normally think about this place, and but it's there. It's necessary. Otherwise, there will be a hole on the earth. This is spaces like that, group and communities like that, works like that. Is this the only place? I don't know. I suppose what's my question is, does awkwardness change in different spaces, like the vague and hidden spaces, or it's different in being awkward in a gallery, which is supposed to be an open, white box and everything's presented space? Does the sense of feeling has much to do with the situation or the space itself?
Yeah, I that's also a very good question. I think that 好像就比如那个莉莉的那一个那一晚上 right? So in that way, what she's trying to do is to create a very public occasion, 一个很公开的场面。But over the past few years, I start to wonder, like, what if I just go and I just be?
Yeah.
就比方来，我去，然后我就说我们吃饭就好了，你们看看那个作品，我们不需要谈，我们吃饭就好。要聊我们就一对一的这样聊，不需要我站在前面，
做个 presentation。
对 presentation yes correct so that's what I mean. So like maybe that's what I mean. I started thinking maybe there are other ways in which that in some ways we there's a kind of refusal of the terms of engagement in trying to be present, and what can be awkward at that moment can then suddenly change and not be awkward, and then be awkward a different way again, and that's because in those situations, then it really depends on whether people are trying to for me reassert old coordinates or previous norms, or they're trying to rapidly arrive at an equilibrium. They're trying to rapidly arrive at certainty, right? And so for me, the sense of awkwardness is an intuition that tells me maybe we don't need to arrive. In fact, trying to get at an equilibrium too quickly is disastrous.
Yeah.
In fact, we should, the awkwardness tells me that actually in those moments, the awkwardness is telling me to slow that down, But in other moments, when people are trying to assert old or previous coordinates, and then maybe I need to move quickly away from that. So that the awkwardness is telling me to, in fact, move
To change. Yeah.
quickly, and kind of escape that situation. And I think that happens, as and that can happen in just even in a conversation, right? Sometimes we sense that 那个尴尬的场面就是，yeah, is 就是一个好像一种another sense, right? 一种感觉 that tells us that and it's a useful sense that tells us that that there are certain directions that we can take that are partly not about accepting the norms that are being introduced, or the protocols that are being introduced, and and also the speed and the relation of that direction that we're moving into.
Yeah. Oh, it's totally true. And actually, well, let's move a little bit, like mobilize the concept of awkwardness. Who I've been thinking, like, at first it's kind of feeling it's discomfort, as you said. It reminds me of a story that not very long ago I was having a cold, a flu. Exactly, I was taking Panadol, like those painkillers to control the symptoms. After my cold is it's getting better, I feel this severe back pain, like my back is broken. It's broken pain. I was so worried. I was like, fuck. I mean, it could be some, like, I don't know, kidney issues or stuff. And I was like, damn. I was yeah. And I talked to a doctor, and she said, okay, it's apparently, like, did some tests and talked, and she said, like, it seems to be okay, but one reason is like she said is possible reason for that is when I was taking Panadol, the painkillers, it takes away all those minor discomfort in my body, in my muscle, in my joint, and everything, like when I lie down, and my body unconsciously stay immobile for a long time, that I didn't move because I feel comfort. Like I don't feel any discomfort. So I didn't change my positions that often, and then that hurt my muscles. And 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 I totally get this in the society, in the community, like being too comfortable is not is sometimes causing me anxious, like, okay, there's something wrong with this, something that I
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and
Sorry.
yeah, just yeah, please, we are having a conversation.
Oh no, it's one reason why I I wanted to, why that evening stayed on my mind was that I realized that even though initially thinking about safe spaces and care is very appealing, but safety can also mean like comfort,
Yes.
in a way that that it can end up creating a kind of dangerous inertia, where
Yeah.
I simply apply the familiar,我回去我熟悉 做工的方式，我跟朋友交往的方式啊，我就回去那样就好了啊。我叫我的朋友来看我的作品，so that what then of course it's safe, right? Um, but then it it I think there's a danger there that I increasingly want to remind myself of and to think about something that, especially in terms of spaces that are not just, or they are more than about safety, that could contain care but it also exceeds the terms of familiar care. Yeah.
嗯
Yeah. Because I think what's neglected is the ways in which, even when we think about, like you said, what is, even if you use a medical term, like thinking about what's healthy for us, right? That sometimes what is healthy is a little discomforting.
，yeah，
Yeah.
凉茶，for example, like very
Yeah.
bitter herbal tea, it's very healthy.
Yes.
It's supposed to be, well, be careful for that, but like, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and in this dimension, like we think about terms like overcome awkward, like how 打破尴尬, like when we enter into a 尴尬场面 and we need to like 打破尴尬. And
对，
also we have those other terms that might be related to this, like humor.
是啊，
It,
是，
it could be a method to 打破尴尬, and it could be the exact reason why it's awkward. Is because it's strange, it's funny, it's humorous, it's potentially, well, I've been thinking of Worm's 1 minute sculptures, like all those
对对
positions the audience can post, and it's awkward. You're on the stage in the museum. How awkward? Like it's super awkward, but at the same time, it's funny. It's making the day.
，yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So and also courage,
Mhm.
perhaps.
And I think actually comedy is interesting. I think I've been thinking about that for the past day, that comedy might be a way of thinking about ways in which the awkwardness is sustained without resolution, but at the same time it becomes, so it's still uncomfortable, but at the same time it also becomes pleasurable. Like, because 因为你想笑啊，所以 right. So it 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 is uncomfortable, but at the same time, it doesn't settle, but it also makes you like laugh, right? It gives you some pleasure. So I think there's something about awkward comedy that actually some that points away, uh, um, you know, through a situation, or to another way of thinking about art. Yeah.
我就还是我会觉得这个是一个非常丰富的、非常丰富的话题。
是啊，
而且我之前就是在今天之前，我会把它 oversimplified into a matter of degrees, like how much care, how much uh, awkwardness can we take? It's just a matter of degree in my mind. But today I've been thinking there are more than one measurement to it. It's not only a matter of degrees, also with the context, with the narrative. It's also with distractions. How much distractions can it create? How much? It's not only how much, but what kind, different kinds of
Mm.
dialogues.
And I think the other way I was thinking about it was that, apart from like a humor guy,
Mhm.
that sometimes there's even just the power of 把你个人的尴尬的那个感觉，把它
Share,
it's kind of shared, but it's like it displaces so that everyone feels 尴尬.
transmit
Yeah. So that,
content.
yeah, so that, because then it's not just everyone point singling you out as the reason for the situation. But then there's now an agreement that everyone needs to figure it out together, right? So I think there's also that kind of that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, awkwardness is a very contaminating sense, and so does humor and laughter, but pain, like watching somebody is being discomforted, it's actually more. It transmits faster than watching somebody suffer. It's actually this one transmits really easily. It's like 浑身不自在啊。呀，我们看还有朋友要问问题吗？大家不要害羞，就如果如果大家有什么问题，当然也可以。如果暂时没有的，后边如果想有一些问题，可以去联系张涵，我们很负责、很那个和蔼可亲的张涵老师。Hello
对，这
Hello
里
啊，然后在那个分享会的听众群里，大家可以如果有任何问题可以 post 出来，与我们这个分享有关的。那如果没有问题，我们就再次感谢 Jason 给我们带来这个非常有深度，而且其实某种意义上可能跟我们每个人都相关，但是在有些语境下又不太好去说的一些话题。然后也欢迎大家继续这样的讨论，或者是起码继续这样的哦。呃点点提了一个问题说，突然想到一个 situation，然后distraction，
比如当你和某人讨论，
就是当别人用一个这件事情，我外婆经常做，但是我觉得这是一个 matter of age，但是有的时候我会发现她 do this in a very strategic way，就是在她觉得不太舒服的时候，这是情感，她会问，她会说，哦，一会儿吃什么啊？会提出一些就是这个 daily routines，然后但是它是 totally irrelevant to the thing that you're discussing。这是一种 awkwardness。另一种我不知道我总结的点点这个说法对不对？另一种 awkwardness 就是当你问到一些问题的时候说，比如说我问到说，哎Jason 有没有谈恋爱？然后let's talk about other things. Let's don't talk about this. 这种 awkwardness， like 这个问问题的人就会shit, I
是
asked
是
the
是是，
wrong like
对
question.
对。
Well, another thing is 有没有谈恋爱？然后这个人说，或者是不是这样？然后说，哇，那边那个面馆很好吃啊。那么这两种，一种是 awkward from distraction，一种是 awkward generated from refusal. Well, distraction is a kind of a refusal, but it's a semi-refusal. It's taking your question, but not refusing it entirely. Is just override it. It's like
Overriding， 对对
cover it
对
with
对，
another
盖上
topic.
去。
Another is put it in suspense, like it's
Yeah,
still in front of us, but we just don't talk about it.
yeah, yeah.
Is there a difference or what's the?
No, I feel like what they share is that there is a difference in terms of just in terms of how we respond to the awkwardness. But I think what's interesting is how what this idea of basically what it means in any situation of uncertainty to play, right? 我们怎么去玩？ So in English, then of course it means that you to play along means that 我们一起玩 or 合得来 right? So when you play along means that it implies certain things in English. It means that you need to follow up. So if someone asks you a question, then to play along, you have to follow up in the way that is expected. So in a situation means that the play sets up certain rules for you. Then you have to decide, okay, all right, I will play along and I will abide by those rules. If you ask, then I will answer. That's the rule of the play. But then both the refusal and the disruption are two ways in which you don't want to play along, right? You acknowledge the rules and you said something else.
Some kind of resistance
Yeah.
effort, pretty
Yeah.
much.
So what's interesting is when conversations often come back to the same place, but the coordinates have shifted. So 有趣的就是他好像比如说你问一个朋友，你有谈恋爱吗？他的反应是哦，我们先去对面那吃饭吧。But then 过了1个小时，在吃饭的当时，忽然间他就说哦，我等一下要见到我的最爱。So it's interesting when under a different set of conditions, he introduces a different awkwardness. 他忽然间跟你说I'm ready to tell you. So that's interesting also. So the disruption can happen using the same kind of language. And then this time the awkwardness is displaced outwards. So I find so it's these kinds of strategies that I find, or what does it say about agency and freedom and the way that we can negotiate and hold power over our language, you know?
Yeah. And also, that reminds me of things like the duration, the time lapse in this. We've been thinking about the case of the story. But what's been changed is one thing is the situation is like one is waiting in a restaurant with eating with good mood and very natural, and one is being confronted with a question and in the middle of the road, and it's like it's one thing changes the context. Another thing is the time in between first the questions being raised and the question being answered.
Yeah.
The time itself, the stretched time itself, it creates it blurs the a normal rhythm of doing things, and it creates a moment of doubt. Yeah. And it's very, very interesting. Actually, I think the work you mentioned about like the 377A code, the law thing, it does have this potential of using a very it's totally opposite thing. I mean, art, especially your work and your approach to the work, that being awkward, being uncertain, being you see where I'm going, being unclear, being discomfort, being all those small moments, and on the other hand, I wouldn't say your enemy, but the opposite side is the law. Is being very clear, is certain, is rigid, is semi-permanent, is always there, it's kind of be challenged, and it's immersed and open. And it's curious to it's very interesting to see how this hidden transcript, hidden in all kinds of ways, can challenge and can potentially become the only way that we can subvert, or we can doubt, create a moment of doubt to something very certain, very powerful, very open, very public, very, very old.
Mm.
That's very interesting to see this.
Yeah, I just put a little context about the same law in the Indian context.
Yeah, that's very, it's a very, very, because I study law in Hong Kong, former colony and common law. There are a lot of those zombie codes in our law system, especially in common law system, because common law changes on the like depends pretty much on having a case properly argued, taking to a high enough court. Like if it's argued in the lower court and solved, then nothing will happen to the law system. But ruling powers of the higher court will consolidate some things. But it highly depends on a real case being
Yes.
talked, being brought
Yeah.
onto the table. And a lot of those cases are actually performative, like
Yes.
like a society or the foundation that founded to change the law.
Yeah.
One even more outrageous, ridiculous law comparing to this is I don't know whether it's still the case, but in Hong Kong, like 10 years ago, it will be illegal for you to be found drunk in a public space.
Oh, wow.
Which is potentially mean that, you know, Lan Guifang is the pub, like all those clubs and pubs, like all those lawyers will tease about this example of the zombie law is that you'll be abnormal to be found sober on the street of Lan Guifang instead of found drunk, right? It's all those pubs and alcohol, like you're
Yeah.
sober and what's wrong with you?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
that the law is always there, and lawyers will think it's no big deal because nobody is enforcing the law. But theorists, artists, and social activists will think, no, it's very real because first,
Yeah.
it's open code and it's there, and second, it poses a consistent risk. It's consistent. It's like a sign. Nobody
Yeah.
enforces it, is another question, but it it shows an attitude. That's what I meant, and it's very important for those nominal things to be changed. Like justice should not only be done; it should be done manifestly, be seen to be done. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
No, absolutely. Like that's the problem because sometimes these nominal protocols or principles, they can create stigma. You know, so even if they are not enforced, they can create that kind of stigma and a negative impression that you know actually has potentially harmful effects.
Mm. Yeah. Let's wrap up for today. It's already 2 hours. And thank you again, Jason.
Thank
And
you everyone for
thanks
staying.
to everyone. Yeah. And looking forward to our discussions in the future. And have a nice day.
Bye.
Oh, bye.